seemed to take care of me a lot better than my cousin did as far as booking and things of that nature. It's like when I first started, when I first got started in Memphis, Jerry would have me booked, Jerry Lawler that is, would have me booked like 2 nights. One in Louisville was a 500-mile drive. The next night, he went out and had me booked again for Saturday.
For something else down here. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I know what you guys are talking about. I'll tell you what you guys are looking for and what you're going to find very shortly.
How good was the Honky Tonk Men? That is the question sitting right there on your screen. Look at that thumbnail. Jake the Snake Roberts on one side, Ric Flair on the other side, and right there in the middle box, staring back at you with that curled lip and that rhinestone confidence, the man himself, Wayne Farris, the Honky Tonk Man, sitting in between two of the most respected, most celebrated names this industry has ever produced. Think about that image for a second. Really sit with it, because that image is the whole argument in one frame. Here is a man that people dismissed, that people laughed at, that people said did not belong at the top of the card. Not the most gifted athlete, not the most technically polished performer, not the toughest guy in the locker room by any measure. And yet there he is, right in the middle, right between legends who are universally acknowledged as among the greatest this business has ever seen. Jake Roberts on one side, a man so psychologically advanced in his craft that entire generations of performers have studied his promos and his match psychology as a masterclass. Ric Flair on the other side, a man who defined an entire era of professional wrestling and whose body of work is so vast and so celebrated that he is mentioned in the first breath of any serious conversation about who the greatest ever was. And Wayne Farris in the middle box, the Honky Tonk Man. That is not an accident, that is the story. That image tells you everything you need to know about where this video is going. And if you want to understand why so many legends of this business had to sit down and genuinely reckon with what he accomplished, you are in exactly the right place. Because here is the honest starting point. If you walked into any wrestling locker room in the late 1980s and asked who deserved to be the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion in the history of the company, the last name you would have heard was his. Not even close. People would have laughed. They would have shaken their heads. They would have said it was politics. They would have said it was smoke and mirrors. They would have said the man could barely wrestle, that he was a cheap knockoff of an icon, a rhinestone Elvis in a wrestling ring, more comedy act than actual competitor. They would have told you he survived on shortcuts and dirty finishes, and that the whole thing was one long, embarrassing chapter that the company would rather forget. Some of them would have been bitter about it. Some of them would have had legitimate grievances. And here is the uncomfortable part. On the surface level, on the level of pure athletic output, they were not entirely wrong. He was not the most technically gifted performer on that roster. He was not the toughest, or the hardest hitting, or the most physically imposing. By almost every conventional standard of what a champion is supposed to represent, Wayne Farris had no obvious business holding that title for as long as he did. And yet he held it for 454 days. Say that number out loud, 454 days. That number stood as the record for the Intercontinental Championship for 35 full years. 35 years. Decade after decade of future Hall of Famers, once-in-a-generation athletes, men who could do things in a wrestling ring that most people can barely imagine, and none of them could touch that number. Not until 2023, when Gunther finally surpassed it. And the moment that record fell, the wrestling world started talking again. People started pulling out old footage, old interviews, old testimonials from the people who were actually there. And they started asking the question that this video is going to answer completely. How does a man like that hold a record like that for that long? How does someone with his reputation, his limitations, his controversial style hold a spot like that and have the legends of the business look back and say they had to respect it? The answer is not luck. The answer is not politics. The answer is not smoke and mirrors. The answer is a specific, deliberate, brilliantly executed understanding of what professional wrestling actually is at its core. Wrestling is not just about moves. It is not just about athleticism. It is about making people feel something so strongly that they cannot look away. Heat is what this business calls it. When a crowd hates you so completely and so genuinely that they will pay money for the chance to watch someone finally destroy you, that is heat. And the Honky Tonk Man was one of the greatest generators of heat this business has ever seen. And if you are enjoying this deep dive into the real stories behind wrestling's greatest careers and the legends who were there, hit that hype feature right now and give this video some hype, because we are going through every single major voice in this debate, one by one, counting down from number 11 all the way to number 1. And when we are done, you are going to see Wayne Farris completely differently than you did when you clicked. We start with the voice you might least expect on this list. Number 11, Diamond Dallas Page. Before Diamond Dallas Page became one of the most beloved performers in wrestling history, before the Diamond Cutter became one of the most over-finishing moves in the business, before his legendary comeback arc, before any of the chapters that made him famous, he was a driver. He was the man behind the wheel of a pink Cadillac at WrestleMania 6. That Cadillac brought the tag team Rhythm and Blues down the entrance ramp in front of tens of thousands of people. And sitting in the orbit of that entrance, watching it all happen from the driver's seat, was DDP. It was a background role. Most people watching at home did not notice him. But what DDP absorbed in that moment stayed with him for the rest of his career. He has spoken about how being around Wayne Farris and Jimmy Hart during one of the grandest moments of their careers taught him something fundamental that cannot be learned in any wrestling school in the world. You do not need to execute a single wrestling move to command the emotional energy of 60,000 people. If your entrance, your look, your presence, and your visual impact can shift the entire temperature of a building before the bell rings, then you understand professional wrestling at a level that transcends technique. Farris understood that completely. He could walk out to that ring, strut, curl that lip, shake those hips, and have an entire arena seething with hatred before he even touched a rope. DDP watched that and filed it away carefully. The understanding of entrance, of visual storytelling, of how a crowd feels before a single move happens, became central to everything DDP built in WCW and beyond. The Honky Tonk Man helped shape Diamond Dallas Page. Almost nobody talks about that, which is exactly the kind of quiet, long-reaching influence that defines a performer whose impact went far beyond any single highlight reel moment. Number 10. Bruce Pritchard. By 1989, the solo chapter was done. The title was gone. The peak had passed. For most performers in that situation, the direction is downward. You drift, you fade, you eventually disappear into the lower card and stop mattering to the story. The creative team, with Bruce Pritchard deeply involved in the decision-making, had a different idea. They formed the tag team Rhythm and Blues, pairing Wayne Farris with Greg "The Hammer" Valentine. On paper, the combination made no sense. Valentine was a serious, technically credible bruiser, the son of the legendary Johnny Valentine, a man who based his entire professional identity on making his matches look legitimate and physically real. And now the plan was to put him in a rock and roll costume, dye his famous blonde hair jet black, and ask him to play straight man to an Elvis impersonator. Valentine pushed back forcefully. He said he was a wrestler, not a clown, and there was no ambiguity in how he felt about it. The standoff only ended when Jimmy Hart and Jesse Ventura convinced him that this reinvention was a genuine last chance to stay relevant in a rapidly changing landscape. Here is what Pritchard saw that Valentine initially could not see. The team worked. The combination of Farris's theatrical swagger and Valentine's genuinely stiff, incredible in-ring style created something that had real traction on the house show circuit. They regularly went up against teams like the Hart Foundation, and the matches drew because the contrast between styles created an interesting product. Pritchard recognized in Farris something that a lot of people overlooked. The man was a creative asset who could be repositioned and rebuilt when the original configuration ran its course. Adaptability in this business is rarer than people think. Most performers who are deeply associated with one specific identity cannot survive the transition when that identity stops working for the audience. Farris survived it. He put on a new version of the costume and made it work again. That deserves real acknowledgement. Number 9. Shawn Michaels. Here is where things get genuinely honest. Shawn Michaels did not have warm feelings about the Honky Tonk Man in those years, and he never tried to pretend otherwise. When Michaels was part of the Rockers with Marty Jannetty, they were working their bodies hard every single night. They were doing things athletically that most of the locker room simply could not match. Flips, high-flying moves, real physical sacrifice on a nightly basis. And then they would look at where Wayne Farris was positioned on the card and what he was collecting, and the frustration would build into something real. Because by the measure of physical output, of bumps taken and athleticism demonstrated, there was a significant gap. The resentment among the younger workers who prided themselves on their in-ring ability was genuine. Michaels felt it deeply and expressed it clearly. He said the guys in the locker room were doing the flips and taking the bumps, while Honky was shaking his hips and getting the big paycheck. That contrast burned. But Michaels also said something that reveals exactly how sharp his understanding of this business always was, even as a young performer. He called it a lesson, a genuine lesson in how the business side of wrestling actually operates. Because athletic ability, as impressive and valuable as it is, represents only one currency in this industry: the ability to occupy a spot on the card with a character that connects with a paying audience, to generate a real emotional reaction that drives ticket sales and merchandise and house show revenue. That is a completely separate currency, and sometimes that second currency is worth more than the first. Farris had mastered that second currency long before most of his contemporaries recognized it existed. His character had heat. His presence served a specific and economically valuable purpose that went well beyond what he could do technically between those ropes. Michaels, who became one of the most complete performers this business has ever produced, carried that lesson into his own career. The deep attention he later paid to character work and the theatrical and emotional dimensions of professional wrestling was partly shaped by watching Wayne Farris get paid for exactly those things. Quietly, the Heartbreak Kid's philosophy was built on many foundations. One of them was watching the Honky Tonk Man prove that character can be worth just as much as a great match. Number 8. Jim Ross. Jim Ross has evaluated more wrestling talent than almost anyone in the history of this industry. He has seen everything from every angle: the commentary booth, the broadcast table, the corporate office, and his assessment of the Honky Tonk Man is focused and precise. Ross calls him a natural heel. In professional wrestling, a natural heel is someone for whom the line between the villain character and the actual person is genuinely blurry. Most performers who play bad guys have to consciously manufacture that quality. They perform arrogance. They perform cowardice. They perform the self-important, irritating quality that makes fans want to see them get what is coming to them. And when the camera turns off, they go back to being regular people. Wayne Farris, according to Ross, did not have a clear off switch. The genuinely annoying quality was present not just on camera and not just in scripted interviews. It was present backstage, in everyday interactions, off the clock. And that authenticity is what made audiences react to him in a way that went beyond simply booing because they were told to boo. He gave them real reasons. The character resonated because it was not entirely a character. Ross also noted that Farris was intensely protective of his position. He fought hard to keep the Intercontinental title. He understood clearly that the title was his value to the company. Without it, he became a novelty act. With it, he was a headliner on every house show in the country, working night after night, filling a specific and essential role in the machine. That desperation to hold his spot fed directly back into the performance. The dirty finishes, the countouts, the cowardly scheming, all of it came from a very real and very human place. He genuinely did not want to lose. And audiences can always feel genuine desperation. It is one of the things that cannot be fully faked. Number 7. Ted DiBiase. Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, thought about this business with the mind of someone who understood every dimension of what it took to build a lasting career and generate real wealth inside this industry. And his perspective on the Honky Tonk Man zeroes in on something almost no one else raises with the same clarity: the secondary market, the income that does not come from television or pay-per-view. The autograph sessions, the merchandise, the personal appearances, the independent events where a performer's ability to connect with fans and stay in character translates directly into real money outside the main weekly product. DiBiase watched Farris work that secondary market with a level of sustained dedication that genuinely impressed him. The key, DiBiase noted, was that Farris never broke character. Not at airports, not at hotels, not in restaurants, not anywhere a fan might encounter him. If someone recognized Wayne Farris in a completely normal, everyday setting, the Honky Tonk Man showed up for that interaction. Not Wayne the person, the character. And that consistency had an enormous economic effect. When the character is always present, always switched on, it stops feeling like a performance. It starts feeling like a real person exists. And fans pay significantly more to have an experience with someone who feels genuinely real than with someone who they can sense is just stepping into a role for a moment and will step back out when the interaction ends. DiBiase described the core gimmick as thin, and he was being accurate. A rude Elvis impersonator who carries a guitar is not a deeply complex creative concept. On paper, it barely holds together, but Farris made it thick. He made it dense and durable and believable by refusing to allow the illusion to break for even a single moment across an entire career. In an era when kayfabe, the strict practice of keeping the fictional world of wrestling separate from reality in the public eye, was beginning to crack around the edges, Farris was one of the last genuine, true believers, and that belief paid real dividends. Number 6. Ric Flair. Ric Flair and Wayne Farris are first cousins, family, which means Flair's perspective carries a weight here that is completely different from anyone else on this list. He has known the man behind the costume for his entire life. He has seen both versions up close, and he still talks about respect. Pay attention to that. Flair spent his career at the absolute top of the NWA, competing in long, technically demanding matches against the best wrestlers the world had to offer. He defined a specific style of performance built on athleticism, storytelling across long match durations, and the ability to carry anyone to a watchable contest. His world and the world Farris built his career in were almost completely different places. Flair acknowledged that plainly. He said Wayne was not going to go 60 minutes with him, not even close. That was simply the honest reality of where their skill sets sat. But then Flair said something that completely reframes the entire conversation. He said Wayne found a gimmick, milked it for everything it had, sang a song, shook his hips, and made $1 million. And Flair said he respected the hustle. Think carefully about what it means to have Ric Flair, a man who gave everything he had to the craft of professional wrestling at its absolute highest level. Look at a first cousin who chose a very different path and say that he respects the hustle. That is not a dismissal decorated with polite language. That is a genuine acknowledgement from someone who understands the business deeply enough to recognize that multiple valid paths to success exist inside this industry. The WWF of the 1980s was a character-driven entertainment machine operating on a national scale. Within that specific environment, the Honky Tonk Man was not a compromise. He was the ideal product. Flair understood that and said so plainly. Number 5. Ultimate Warrior. No moment in the Honky Tonk Man's entire career carries more weight than SummerSlam 1988. And no one is better positioned to explain why than the man who delivered the ending. The Ultimate Warrior arrived at the very first SummerSlam and accomplished what no one had managed to do in over a year. He took the Intercontinental Championship, but the way he took it is the part that tells the whole story. 31 seconds. The match lasted 31 seconds. Because the Honky Tonk Man had spent 14 months running away from every credible challenger through disqualifications, count-out victories, guitar shots when the referee was occupied, and every underhanded method available to him, the audience had built up an extraordinary amount of frustrated emotion. They had been waiting and been denied over and over again. They came to arenas expecting to finally see the title change hands and went home disappointed repeatedly. And all of that accumulated frustration was sitting in that building at SummerSlam like pressure in a sealed container. When the Warrior came down that aisle, the container started cracking. When the match ended in 31 seconds, it's shattered completely. Warrior described the dynamic plainly. Honky spent 14 months running from everyone, and when Warrior finally got his hands on him, it was over before anyone could process what they were seeing. Warrior saw himself as the new era arriving to replace what came before. He called that night the moment the 80s died. He called Farris a transitional piece, and he was right. But transitional piece does not mean unimportant. Transitional piece means essential. The entire purpose of the Honky Tonk Man's reign was to create the conditions for exactly that explosion, to accumulate heat, to hold audience frustration, to build the pressure to a point where any other kind of release would have felt insufficient, and then to absorb complete and total destruction in 31 seconds with zero ego, entirely for the good of the next era. Warrior got the rocket fuel boost and went straight to the main event conversation. Farris gave him that boost by doing his job without reservation. Number 4, Jake Roberts. This part of the story cannot be told honestly without sitting with the darkest moment in it, and that moment involves Jake the Snake Roberts. The feud between Jake and the Honky Tonk Man was one of the more memorable of that era. At WrestleMania 3, within that feud, something happened that Jake has never been able to move past. The guitar incident. Honky hit Jake with a guitar. On the surface, it looks like a standard wrestling moment, except Jake Roberts maintains firmly and consistently that the guitar was real, not a prop designed to break safely on impact, not modified in any way to protect the person receiving the hit, real. And he says the damage that impact caused to his neck stayed with him for years after that night. Jake's words on this are direct and carry genuine pain behind them. He talked about the code that exists in the professional wrestling locker room. You protect your brother. The person in the ring with you is trusting you with their physical safety. You look out for them the way you would want to be looked out for. And he said Wayne Farris did not protect him. Whatever the complete truth of that specific situation is, these things in wrestling rarely resolve cleanly in one direction. The fact that Jake still holds this position with such clarity and such consistent feeling tells you something meaningful about how deeply it cut. The trust that exists inside a wrestling ring is not a small thing. It is the foundation of everything that happens there. When that trust feels broken, it does not heal easily. And in Jake's case, based on everything he has said publicly, it appears it never fully healed at all. The Honky Tonk Man's legacy includes this. The complete and honest picture requires it. Jake Roberts felt he was not protected. That matters and deserves to be heard alongside everything else. Number 3, Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat did not want to lose his Intercontinental title to Wayne Farris. He has said so directly and without hesitation. When the office told him the plan, his immediate reaction was that someone was joking. He was being asked to put over a comedic gimmick act, to hand a championship he had earned through genuine athletic credibility to someone dressed like a bargain bin Elvis with a guitar for a finishing weapon. His frustration made complete sense. Steamboat was a paragon of the craft. He brought athletic integrity and emotional storytelling to everything he did. He had the respect of the entire locker room, and the proposal felt like it worked against everything he stood for as a performer. But here is what Steamboat also said when he looked back at it. He said Vince McMahon knew exactly what he was doing, because the heat that the Honky Tonk Man generated by stealing the title through cheating from someone as beloved and legitimate as Steamboat was extraordinary. It was not just heat. It was personal. The audience did not just boo the new champion as a reflexive response to a villain winning. They felt that something genuinely wrong had been done to someone they cared about. They felt protective of Steamboat. They felt outraged on his behalf. And that very specific emotional cocktail of outrage and protectiveness for the hero who was wronged drove the entire WWF mid-card narrative for well over a year after that title change. Steamboat's credibility made Honky's villainy feel real and urgent. Without a convincing and beloved victim, the villain has no real power. Steamboat was the most convincing possible victim. Everything that followed, every dirty title defense, every frustrated challenger, every building full of people screaming for justice, was built on the foundation of that single moment. And Steamboat, to his real credit, recognized that in the end. Number 2, Bret Hart. Bret Hart held a very specific view of what the Intercontinental Championship was supposed to represent. To him, it was the worker's belt. It was the title that belonged with the best in-ring performer in the company. The man who could go out every single night and have great matches that elevated everyone around him and told compelling stories through the language of athletic competition. That is what the belt meant to Bret. It was a statement about craft and excellence. And watching Wayne Farris hold it for 454 days through count-out victories and disqualification finishes and guitar shots and every underhanded shortcut available felt to Bret like a direct betrayal of what that championship was supposed to mean. He called Farris a paper champion. That phrase says everything about how Hart viewed the situation. A champion who holds the title without defending it in the way a champion should, who survives through cowardice and manipulation rather than competition, who runs from real matches while somehow keeping the belt around his waist. To a technician of Bret's conviction, it felt like a slap in the face to everyone working hard to elevate the title through genuine athletic performance. Bret's critique is legitimate on its own terms. The matches were not great by any traditional standard, but here is the thing Bret also said, and it is the most important part of everything he offered on this subject. He said that to the fans, it worked. They hated him. Those 5 words are the whole counter-argument compressed into one sentence. Because the job of a heel champion is not to have great matches. The job is to make the paying audience absolutely desperate to see the title change hands. And if fans were sitting in those buildings and standing up and screaming for anyone to take that belt from the Honky Tonk Man, then the championship was performing its precise intended function in that era. What Bret saw as a failure of athletic standards was actually a perfectly executed emotional operation. The Intercontinental title was not being used as an athletic award during that reign. It was being used as a machine for generating audience frustration and investment. And nobody has ever operated that specific machine more effectively. Number 1, Jerry Lawler. And we arrive at the beginning of it all. Jerry the King Lawler, first cousin, mentor, the man who handed Wayne Farris the entire philosophical foundation upon which everything else was eventually built. Lawler ran the Memphis wrestling territory for years and developed an approach to this business that was distinct from almost anywhere else in the country. The core belief in Memphis was not that the most impressive match wins. The core belief was that psychology wins. That getting inside the audience's head and manipulating their emotions is more valuable than any sequence of athletic moves could ever be. Memphis wrestling was constructed around drawing the maximum amount of money while exposing the minimum amount of your body to long-term physical damage. The approach relied on stalling, on verbal provocation, on using your presence and your voice to wind an audience so tight that by the time any real physical action occurred, the crowd was already at a point of genuine desperation. Lawler called Farris the ultimate Memphis export. He took every lesson the territory had refined about psychological warfare with a live audience and brought it to the largest stage the business had ever seen. The Memphis experience taught Farris how to make 20 minutes of relatively limited physical action feel like the most infuriating experience a crowd could possibly sit through. How to work the emotions of an audience without working your body into the ground. How to generate heat without generating bumps. And the genius built into that approach, the part Lawler always grasped better than most, is that it protects the machine. A body not absorbing punishment every single night is a body still capable of working years from now. Farris could wrestle over 100 matches against Lawler alone inside that territory and sustain a long-running rivalry without a single contest needing to be a physical masterpiece. The rivalry worked on emotion, on psychology, on the audience's deep and sustained need to see the villain finally receive the punishment he had been avoiding. Lawler built that understanding into Farris long before the rhinestone jumpsuit and the national television contract existed. Everything that made the Honky Tonk Man effective in the WWF, the stalling, the provoking, the cowardice, the way he could fill a building with genuine rage just by existing in it, that all started in Memphis, with family, with a king who understood the game at a level most people never reach. And now here is where everything lands. Here is the real and complete answer to the question that has been sitting on that thumbnail since the moment you clicked. Let us think about what we have actually walked through together. We have gone through 11 different people, 11 different vantage points, 11 different lived experiences of working alongside, working against, watching from ringside, or being directly shaped by Wayne Farris and what he built. And across all 11 of those perspectives, not one of them says he was the best pure wrestler in the building, not a single one. But almost every single one of them says something else. Something that matters more in the context of what professional wrestling is actually trying to accomplish. They say he was effective. They say he understood the game. They say he knew his role and played it with more conviction and more discipline than almost anyone who has ever held a championship in this business. And collectively, across those 11 voices, the portrait that emerges is not of a man who stumbled into a historic reign by accident. It is the portrait of a man who knew exactly what he was doing every single night for over a year. So here is the real and complete answer to that question. How good was the Honky Tonk Men? The answer does not live in technical ability or match ratings or athletic output. The answer lives in what he made people feel. He made them furious. He made them desperate. He made them spend their money and give up their weekends and fill arenas all over the country and stand up screaming at a man in a rhinestone jumpsuit because they could not bear the sight of him holding a championship they felt he did not deserve. He turned the Intercontinental title into a machine that ran entirely on audience frustration for over a year and never once lost pressure. And when the moment finally arrived, when the Ultimate Warrior came sprinting down that aisle at SummerSlam and ended it all in 31 seconds, the building did not just cheer, it detonated. And that detonation was not just about the Warrior. It was not just about the new era arriving. It was the product of 14 months of careful, sustained, professionally disciplined heat building by Wayne Farris. Every dirty finish, every cowardly countout, every guitar shot, every sneering interview, every hip shake thrown in the face of a crowd that wanted to tear him apart. All of it was building toward that single release. And that release made the Ultimate Warrior's career. The heat transfer was total and immediate. Farris held the audience's frustration like a reservoir holds water. When SummerSlam broke the dam, it flooded the next era and lifted everything on the other side. Hulk Hogan saw a smart businessman who understood his limitations completely and stayed within them to generate real money. Let us be clear about what Hogan actually said about this. Hogan occupied the very top of that card during the peak of Honky's intercontinental reign. Hogan was the biggest star in the industry, arguably in the history of the industry up to that point. And when Hogan looked down the card at Wayne Farris, he did not see a problem. He saw an economic engine. Hogan made a distinction that the wrestling business often fails to make clearly enough. The difference between a tough guy and a smart guy. Farris was not the toughest man in the locker room. He was not going out there and physically battering people or taking enormous punishment. But he was a smart guy. He understood the money-making mechanics of the business in a way that most of his locker room peers never fully grasped. Hogan's point was simple and direct. People paid to watch the Honky Tonk Man get his head kicked in. That sentence contains an entire business model. He did not need to be great at the physical craft. He needed to be great at making audiences pay for the experience of watching him suffer. And he was extraordinary at exactly that. Hogan respected that. From the top of the card, looking down at the mid-card machine running beneath him, he saw a performer who understood his purpose and served it faithfully night after night. Jerry Lawler saw a student who perfected Memphis psychology and carried it further than anyone expected. Ted DiBiase saw a man whose commitment to his character was so absolute that the character became indistinguishable from the person. Jim Ross saw a natural heel who never had to reach far for the arrogance because it was always genuinely present. Shawn Michaels, through real frustration, saw a lesson about how the business actually pays its people. Ric Flair, his own cousin, looked across the divide of their very different careers and said he respected the hustle. Ricky Steamboat called it a joke and then admitted Vince was right all along. Bret Hart called him a paper champion and then acknowledged that the fans hated him, which means it worked. The Ultimate Warrior described him as the transitional piece that ignited a new era. Diamond Dallas Page sat in a driver's seat and carried the lesson about visual presentation forward into his own legendary career. Bruce Pritchard saw a performer flexible enough to be rebuilt and redeployed when the first chapter finished. The guitar incident with Jake Roberts is real, it is serious, and it lives permanently inside this legacy. It belongs in the full picture, and the full picture is complicated, as it almost always is for careers that carry this much weight and existed this close to the edge of what the business asked of its performers in that era. But the record stands as it stands. 454 days, 35 years before anyone touched it, a SummerSlam moment that remains one of the great payoffs in wrestling history, a quiet influence on performers who came after him and carried his lessons without always knowing where those lessons originated. He was the perfect antagonist for a transitional era in this business. The man an entire wrestling company built its mid-card story around for over a year because he was so extraordinarily good at being hated that the machine could not run properly without him. His legacy is not about being the best wrestler in the world. His legacy is about being the absolute best at making an audience need to see him lose. And in professional wrestling, that is its own specific, earned, and very real form of greatness. The number proves it. Wayne Farris found a gimmick. He lived it completely and without compromise. He made it work in ways nobody predicted. He gave the next man the biggest moment of his career and took nothing but 31 seconds of destruction in return. And he left a mark on this industry that took 35 years for anyone to surpass. That is how good the Honky Tonk Man was. Not the best wrestler, not the most athletic, not the toughest, but the best at his specific, irreplaceable job. And in professional wrestling, that is all that has ever really mattered.